So why aren't we getting economic growth? Has anyone noticed that the economy kind of sucks? Anybody? I don't know what things are like in Kansas. Oddly enough, I have a friend who moved here from Texas that I got to visit while I'm here, and her name is Dorothy. I mean, what are the chances? But anyway, I was visited with Arthur Laffer in Nashville, where he hangs out now because California's taxes were too high. And he said, in terms of economic impact, if regulations are 1, taxes are 10, and money is 100. And the interesting thing is nobody talks about money. It's the biggest single factor affecting the economy. It's what drives the economy, and no one even talks about it. They argue over tax plans and they argue over regulations, but money is the biggest single impact on the economy. And money, the Federal Reserve, is what crashed the economy in late 2008. The Fed caused the housing bubble, the Fed caused the housing bust, and the Fed caused the crash of the real economy. A lot of people don't realize that. This is the worst recession since the Great Depression and the worst recovery in the history of anything. I mean, these are the lines. The employment went lower and has recovered. I think I calculated that the rate. Obama was so proud of his stimulated economy when he got that 2 percentage point cut in Social Security taxes. And I guess he could be proud because at the rate we've recovered this year, we will get to full employment in 2083. So I guess he could be proud of that. When I saw what was going on, people should be suspicious of this. Why is this happening? Tax rates are lower now than they were under Clinton when the economy was growing at 4%. Oh, the regulatory thing is bad, but it hasn't really kicked in yet. You know, the Obamacare, what happened? The answer is, on October 6th of 2008, the Federal Reserve started paying interest on bank reserves for the first time in its 95-year history. And the economy just crashed. It hit a wall. The Fed gave the economy a heart attack. Basically, if any of you guys are in business, what's happened is people stopped buying. And what buying is, what causes a recession is the flow of money through the economy slows down or stops. That's what demand is. It's money flowing in the economy. It's not government spending. It's the flow of money. And the Fed basically stopped the flow of money. They paid the banks to sit on money and not circulate it. And that's what the banks did. And when I found out about it, there was hardly any publicity of it. I wrote an article that was published in December 9th of 2008 saying, this will crash the economy. And it did. And 2 years later, I wrote another article that said, see? The bad news is the economy will not recover until the Fed stops doing that. And yet, there's no interest. I mean, the average congressman doesn't even know they voted for that when they voted for the TARP bill. It was slipped in to the Senate version of the TARP bill on October 1st of 2008, and nobody even knew it was in there. So that sort of annoys me a little. Okay, here's what happened. The problem isn't so much that the Fed pays interest on bank reserves. The ECB in Europe does that, but they pay interest on bank reserves at about a quarter of the market rate. The Fed is paying above the market rate. The best investment a bank has is to leave their money in deposit in the Fed and not do anything with it. And the problem isn't that it discourages lending. It isn't lending. It discourages what's called the money multiplier, the system the Fed developed over 95 years to inject money into the economy and turn it into demand. They just blew it up, and they didn't replace it with anything. And so the economy just crashed and has been rotten ever since. Right now, I looked at the T-bill rates. The rate on a 90-day T-bill today is minus 0.01%. You buy a 90-day T-bill, and you get, for $1 million, you get less than $1 million 90 days from now. I mean, we've never seen anything like this. Okay, this is, I mean, if you guys like to follow the stock market reacts instantly to changes in government policy. And if you look at the movement in the S&P 500 during that period of time, it's obvious that it wasn't Lehman Brothers that crashed the economy, it was interest on reserves. The S&P 500 had recovered all the ground it had lost after the Lehman crash, and then interest on reserves took it down for the count. You can see the inflection point in the unemployment, the employment numbers. They accelerate. They were going down because what happened in the housing bubble, here's what happened. In March of 2001, the gold price was $251 an ounce. The Fed inflated for 7 years. Everyone saw them steadily inflated. The way you protect yourself from inflation is you buy hard assets with borrowed money. But the government came up and said, hey, let's let people with no capital play this game. Let's let them do it with housing, no money down, Community Reinvestment Act. So you had this huge movement into inflation hedges. And then in February of 2008, the Fed stopped the game, took the punch bowl away, brought the gold price down. All those inflation hedges collapsed. And that collapsed Lehman Brothers. You had a fall in employment, but we've had recessions before. It would have been like the other recessions. It would have pulled out except for that. Interest on reserves accelerated the decline and just kept it going down. So the interest on reserves, basically, the Fed blew up its whole system. Since that time, they tripled the size of the monetary base, and it's had no effect at all. Now, people talk about the Fed printing money. In a sense, the Fed isn't printing money. They're printing one-day T-bills, and using them to buy 5-year T-bonds. There won't be a lot of inflation until the Fed stops paying interest on reserves, and then it will have to contract its balance sheet to prevent, an inflationary explosion, but at least the economy will start moving again. They can get their way out of this once they recognize the error. I just don't know if Bernanke, I wonder sometimes, if he woke up this morning and realized he'd put 10 million people out of work, would he come to the microphone and say, hey, you know what? Oops. Or would he try to, not notice it or not and cover it up because he just wouldn't want to admit how he screwed up. But this is the problem with progressivism. You give a small group of people with really high IQs and really great degrees from really elite institutions all this power and no accountability and no view of the wider world. You can have things like this. So here's some stuff I copied out of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Everything went haywire when they started paying interest on reserves. They put out this report every month, and they don't even read their own report. You look at the thing, it's obvious something drastic happened there, and they caused it, and they just go blithely on. So this is the value of the dollar. Not too great in terms of gold. Essentially, our dollar, from the time I was a kid, the dollar's lost 97% of its value against gold and like 77% of its value against the GDP deflator. This is our 40-year experiment in fiat money. We just can't we can't have an undefined unit of measure. That's going to have to be tackled. Right now, as I said in my article, Newt Gingrich is the only guy who even mentions the dollar in his website. Perry doesn't, Romney doesn't. Romney, I've talked to him, he doesn't even know what the dollar is. So I'm serious. I asked him a question about the dollar, he wandered off to Chinese T-bond holdings somewhere. So, okay, we can't get out of this. Obama wants to tax the rich. He wants to tax the rich for the sake of it. It won't bring in any money. It'll just depress the economy. We've had tax rates as high as 90%. We've had tax rates as low as 28%. the amount of money the government gets doesn't change. It's basically you get 18% of the GDP, so the only thing worth doing is making GDP grow faster. It's just pointless. I mean, it's like, I don't know where, well, he's a progressive. Progressives like to do this sort of thing. I tried to simulate what would happen if you had the fair tax, and I took a look, if you put in the fair tax, every billionaire in the world is going to move here. Every corporation in the world is going to move its headquarters here. I mean, you're going to have, like, illegal alien billionaires, you know, landing on the beach in Florida. But you know, when Ireland cut its corporate income tax from 50% to 12.5%, its economy grew at 7.4% a year for the next 10 years. Double the size of the economy. The fair tax takes it to zero. There's no tax on capital at all. The reason I like the fair tax is because it will give the highest possible rate of economic growth. Because a lot of people don't realize this, but the economy gets a 48% annual return on non-residential assets. Imagine what your IRA would look like if you got 48% a year return. Your IRA would double every 18 months at that rate of return. So basically, the way we win, the US wins, and the way Kansas wins, is simply to get the most capital investment inside your borders. That's how you win the game. And one way to get a lot of capital investment is don't discourage it, don't tax it. And there's no need to tax it. If for every dollar that's invested, the federal government gets 18% of every dollar of GDP, which means that it effectively gets a 9% return on people investing capital in the US. So right now, what Obama wants to do is take the dollars away and invest them in T-bills at zero, rather than having the private sector invested and yield 9% to the government. 48% to the country as a whole, 9% to the federal government. See, I don't think tax reform has to be revenue neutral, because you can't go broke borrowing at zero and investing at 9%. You can't, you know? So I took a very conservative view, just saying just the dollars themselves. Forget the incentive effects, forget money flooding in from anywhere else. You just assume that people take the dollars of investment income they saved from the fair tax and reinvest it. You'd get 2 percentage points of growth out of that. 2 percentage points of growth makes all the difference. It transforms everything. I mean, the whole country. Now, how many of you are concerned about the deficit and the debt? Anybody here? Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's a problem right now, but growth is the real problem. But see, one of the interesting things, people talk about the federal government as if it had a balance sheet with only a right side. You have a debt, but they never look at the assets. Like right now, I would bet that General Electric Corporation has more debt than any of you. But they're also richer than any of you. How can that be? How could they have more debt and yet be richer? The answer is, you got to look at the asset side of the balance sheet. What's on the asset side of the federal government's balance sheet is the present value of their future revenue streams. When someone lends you money, they're not really lending against a car or something. They're lending against your income in the future that you can pay the loan back with. So that you have the level of your income and the rate of growth of your income determines how much money they'll lend you. It's the same with a government. I mean, right now, the world markets are happy to lend to the Treasury at zero. Here, it's free, or we'll even pay you to take it. The interest rate on 5-year inflation-adjusted bonds right now is -1%. People are paying the federal government 1% real just to hold their money for them. Anyway, on this chart, that little red dot just above the 2.1, can you see it? Yeah. That is the debt. The actual debt we have right now, 15.2 trillion, that's the gross debt. The yellow bar is the unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare. That's really the debt. And the debt is a problem. At the low growth rates, assumed by the Social Security trustees and the CBO. The fact is, it's a high enough percentage of the present value of future federal revenues that you wouldn't really be able to pay it. I mean, a country, you wonder why Greece imploded and Italy's imploded. What the markets do is they calculate the present value of your future revenues and say what primary surplus above your expenses but not counting interest could you expect to run. It's usually for a government, it's 2 or 3% of GDP at most. And then they multiply that by your debt or by your present value of your income and say that's how much debt you can have. When Greece went from growing at 4% a year to shrinking at 5% a year, the present value of their future revenues fell by about 95%, and they're bankrupt. The only way we can pay this is to get the growth rate up. But the federal government the present value of federal revenues is so sensitive to the growth rate that it would be worth it to eliminate the entire corporate income tax, 2% of GDP, if you got 0.1% more growth. 1/10 of a percentage point of growth pays for the whole thing. And the fair tax, if it gave you 2%, 2 percentage points of economic growth, it raises the present value of future government revenues from something like, I think, 382 trillion to infinity, literally infinity. That's why the financial markets relaxed in the around 2005, 2006, 2007. As soon as you get the growth rate up above the interest rate, the present value goes to infinity. And people look at your balance sheet, they say, you have an infinite amount of money. That looks safe, you know? So really, I mean, the people in Washington, I met a lot of the members of the freshman class in the House and the Senate. They were so determined to cut spending, it was a waste of time. They should have spent all their time on economic growth because what did they get? Nothing. They got nothing, and they got nothing on growth either. If I were running it, I'd give the Democrats whatever they want on the spending side to get the growth side. Because that's the way you win. There's no way you can cut spending by an infinite amount, but you can raise the present value of future GDP by an infinite amount, and it doesn't take that much. All we have to do is grow like we've always grown. You get above, America typically averages over 3% GDP growth. Present value is infinity. You know, we can make it on that. So anyway, I came up with one of the questions you have in Washington is, how are you going to pay for that tax cut? It's a suicide mission to have revenue neutral tax reform because if you make it revenue neutral, there are going to be losers and they're going to fight back. The only tax reform that has any chance politically is one that cuts taxes for everyone. One of the things Gingrich's plan does is cut taxes for everyone. And in this sense, I didn't tell him this when I saw him, but Laffer's curve actually works against conservatives a bit. Because they say, well, if it doesn't raise revenues right now, this year, you didn't pay for the tax cut. All that matters is that you raise the present value of future revenues. And it takes so the Laffer curve doesn't really work, so we have the Woodhill curve here. And it says basically you would cut taxes in half to get half a percentage point of GDP growth. You'd cut them in half to get that. In theory, if you could really borrow that amount of money at 2.9% real, you could cut taxes to zero if you got growth above 3%. You can't actually borrow that kind of money without driving up interest rates, but within the range of the kind of tax cuts we're talking about, all the tax cuts pay for themselves because they produce more growth. The contrary of it is you never raise taxes. You can't raise taxes with our tax system without depressing growth more than it's worth. The federal government ends up worse off and the country ends up much worse off. So basically, if our representatives, or even Obama, really understood the numbers, they would want to cut taxes. If you owned the federal government, you would cut taxes. You got to keep all the money. Well, there's a famous saying from Mark Twain. it's very difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends upon him not understanding it. Progressives like tax increases because they depress the economy, which gives the insiders relatively more power. More people are at their mercy, more dependency, more, if you're dependent on government, if you think your survival depends on government, you're going to vote Democrat. I mean, I can't blame you because survival is survival. So anyway, that's pretty much it. Economic growth. The fair tax, I like the fair tax because it will produce the highest rate of growth. But I like some other things about it, some things people don't realize. For example, the fair tax, if you put it in right now, would bail out the housing market, because the fair tax would raise the prices of all existing housing, and a lot of them would come above water right now. It would raise the value of all existing cars for car loans. So the fair tax has lots of, but the biggest thing about the fair tax is it's the only tax that's really compatible with a free people.
Oh, amen. I knew we were going to get to the good part.
Well, I write about economics, but I want to see a vote on the fair tax. I want to see a national referendum on the fair tax because I believe it was.
Okay, let's show of hands. Shall we have a show of hands here?
Who would vote
fair
for
tax.
It?
Okay,
Yeah.
we're doing good.
So anyway, that's all I had to say, and I really appreciate the chance to talk to you.